Greetings, scholars. What I need to do is go over some materials that's covered in chapters 3 and 4. What I want to do is give you a timeline, because chapters 3 and 4 discusses British colonization, but it does so by geography. The reason it does that is because once you get to chapter 5, geographically they're going to look at each section of the country. However, the timeline to show you when each part of the British colonies were established, I think will give you an added understanding of what's going on, the situation in the quote-unquote New World as these guys make their way. So what we're going to do is we're going to go from the state-of-the-art movie studio to the homeschool central of the Depew family. Now, I know that when you guys were in kindergarten, you had, and in first grade, right around the first week of November, you were all starting to draw pictures in art class. Something closely akin to this. And you were talking about people who had buckles on their hats and everything. And for most people, from that, they drew the conclusion that the Pilgrims were the first people who came to the country. But this is not entirely true. Well, it's not at all true. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about these early colonists. And then once I give you this overview of the timeline, we're going to get into each one of these primary issues dealing with each one of these colonies as we move forward. Okay? Now, I'll go ahead and use this. Our timeline here is just from 1600 to 1700, basically. There are two colonies that we really need to focus on. North Carolina and Georgia aren't created until after 1700, and Georgia the last in 1730. Those two are created from this Carolina colony. Everything from the bottom of the Chesapeake to Florida was considered the Carolina colony from 1663 all the way to 1712. 1712, North Carolina and South Carolina are divided, and then Georgia is created in 1730. So we have that part of it going on. But what we need to see is what's going on from 1600 to 1650 primarily. Because what you've got is in your textbook, you get the settlement of the southern colonies, which is Virginia, Maryland, and then the Carolina colony is what you're going to get. And then you go to the northern colonies, which you get the Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay colony and Rhode Island. And then you get the middle colonies, which are New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And that's how they break it up. They break it up into the southern colonies, the northern colonies, and the middle colonies. But as you can see, all of those colonies are established at a different time. Okay, so geographically it's going to help in later chapters, but at this point I think we miss some nuances of what's going on as we look at this. So we'll go ahead and start with 1607 with Virginia. Gotta have my coffee. Now, the Virginia colony is the first to be established. It's established 1607, and as you read in your text, it was not well done. It was messed up from the very beginning. The people in Virginia they weren't really planning to colonize. Most of the people who came to Virginia believed they were going to be pirates, which we'll talk about later. But from 1607 until 1619, the sole British colony in North America was Virginia, and technically it wasn't even a colony. It was just a company, right? The Virginia Company. That's a joint stock company that was established. But in 1619, the Pilgrims, those folks that settle in New England, receive a charter to come and join the Virginia Company. To come and join the Virginia Company. Now, when they do this, they wind up really far away from Virginia. Not only that, not only are they really far away from Virginia, but they wind up having the Dutch, who are also actively exploring their area from the Hudson Bay over to what we call New York. So the Dutch are actively involved in exploration in North America, which sort of begs the question for me, why did the Pilgrims, knowing they were 700 miles away from Virginia, decide to establish themselves somewhere that put the Dutch in between them and the Virginia colony? The other name for the Pilgrims is the Separatists. They wanted to be separate from England, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in 1619, the Pilgrims come and they establish their settlements in Plymouth, and the next colony that comes is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1628, decides to settle close to where the Pilgrims are. Why? They've got religious identity in common with them. They also they share this kind of notion of Puritan orthodoxy, and these guys also are trying to show England what a perfect society looks like. Okay, I think the Pilgrims would have been happy never to have heard from England again, but when the Massachusetts Bay Company settles just north of them in 1628, they wind up eventually getting blended together by the English crown. Now, the next colony that gets established is the Maryland colony, back to the southern colonies, in 1632. Now, the land that Maryland goes to was the land that the Pilgrims were supposed to go to. The land north of the Chesapeake Bay, above the Virginia Company, was where they were supposed to go. And since Charles I is King of England at this point, they tried to establish a Catholic colony in the Chesapeake Bay. Then, of course, 1636, Rhode Island is created because of the stringent rules of the Massachusetts Bay Company. People who are religious dissenters, people who are irreligious, are run off from the Massachusetts Bay Company because it's very religiously motivated, and they create the Rhode Island colonies. Now, all this time, while this is going on, the Dutch are in our backcountry. The Dutch are in New York. They have come from the Hudson Bay, and they've come down to St. Lawrence Seaway, and these guys have started colonizing. 1609, the Dutch send Henry Hudson looking for the Northwest Passage. And what he finds is, he finds what we call today Hudson Bay. In 1619, the same year that the Pilgrims arrive, the Dutch establish what they call the Dutch West Indies Company. Okay? 1624, the Dutch use fur trade, the fur trade, as their primary export from this territory. And in 1626, we have Manhattan Island purchased by the Dutch, and we get the creation of New Netherlands and New Amsterdam. Okay, so all this is taking place prior to the Massachusetts Bay Company being established in North America. It's very interesting to me that the Pilgrims, who had been in Holland up to 1618, the Pilgrims who had been in Holland come home and get a charter and then head for the New World, the same time the Dutch are establishing their presence in the New World at the same time. It's very telling to me, and I read all these texts that talk about how the Pilgrims were off course, how they mistakenly landed in the wrong place and all this stuff. But in reality, you've got to be a pretty pathetic sailor in this time period, in the 17th century, to be 700 miles off your mark and not realize it. Okay? So I'm pretty sure that these pilgrims sort of knew where they were, and they had their own agenda. They had their own agenda when they landed. Now, during this period, you're going to have the King of England declared a tyrant, and you're going to have the British Civil War. It's going to be called the time of the Great English Republic under Cromwell. When Cromwell dies, you get what's referred to as the Restoration. Charles II, Charles I's son, of course Charles I had been beheaded, but his son, Charles II, is brought back to England to restore the monarchy. Now, Charles II has a brother. His name is James. The worst thing in the world that you need as a monarch is to have a younger brother just waiting to take your place. So what's going to happen, 1664, Charles is going to give a massive land grant to his brother, James II, and he's going to be declared the Duke of York. Now, prior to the Duke of York leaving England to go take his property, there will be a land grant given to other friends of the king. Lord Salisbury, John Colton, and actually Lord Salisbury's personal secretary, for all of you who've had philosophy, was a man named John Locke. John Locke, who is famous and significantly important in American political history and American government, wrote the treatises on government, the first and second treatises on government, based on what he had done working in the Carolina colony. John Locke wrote their original charters. He was able to experiment with creating a government system from the ground up. And so John Locke is doing this political experimentation while he's helping to establish the Carolina colony. So the Carolina colony, from the bottom of the Chesapeake to the north of Florida, is the sole colony in that part of the South from 1663 until 1712. Okay? Then, of course, you've got New York, and from New York, when James sends his navy, his fleet, to New Amsterdam, he declares to the people that they are now British subjects, and he claims New Amsterdam and New Netherlands in his name for England, and he changes the name to New York State Colony, and the city of Manhattan will be called New York City. Okay, so this happens in 1664. Also in 64, land is divided out and given to two of James's friends to create New Jersey. And then in 1681, William Penn arrives to settle a dispute between the two Quakers who had come into possession part of New Jersey. Once William Penn comes, he sees how fertile the land is, and he goes back to England and asks for a charter. And William Penn comes back in 1681 to establish Pennsylvania. And again, North Carolina and Georgia are the latecomers to the show, especially Georgia the last. Georgia, some of you may have heard that Georgia was established as a prison colony, but it wasn't really. What it was an attempt by John Oglethorpe to eliminate the debtors' prisons in England. So everyone who was brought to Georgia colony had been in the debtors' prison and were being able to work off their debt. They were being able to work off their debt in this Georgia colony. One thing about that Georgia colony, while John Oglethorpe was in charge, he forbade the institution of slavery because the purpose of Georgia was to eliminate the debtors' prisons. And so while he was in control of the colony of Georgia, the only labor that was used were the people who were in the debtors' prisons, indentured servants, who came to the New World so that they could work off their debts and start a new life. It's not till after Oglethorpe is removed, once he's no longer the governor, then Georgia settles in with the Carolina Company's people who have established the institution of slavery in North America following 1663, and Georgia becomes a slave colony also. This is the timeline. This is a chronology. For me, the most important issues are those surrounding the Pilgrims and the Dutch, and these colonies in the middle colonies, the New York, the New Jersey, the Pennsylvania colonies, as it relates to the Dutch and what takes place. Shortly after Charles II dies, his daughter is made Queen of England along with her husband, William of Orange of the Dutch. Charles II's daughter, Mary, marries William of Orange, hence the famous college William and Mary are the monarchs that take the English throne. And so the Dutch are then included in this whole gambit. So this is the timeline. It's significant for what it shows. The geography your textbook wants to focus on, but I wanted us to look at the timeline. The timeline is important for us, and so as we move forward, we will start looking at the Virginia Company, and then we'll talk about the Pilgrims. With the Virginia Company, we're going to discuss issues such as the headright system and the indentured servant system that is used to increase the population. We'll talk about the Pilgrims and their desire to be separate from England, and then we'll talk about the Massachusetts Bay Company and their desire to create a city on a hill, sort of a perfect utopia. And then we'll cut forward and talk about the Carolina colony and the introduction of slavery into the North American British colonies. So stay tuned. I should have those for you shortly. Until then, you need to continue to read your textbook and take your quizzes. Your primary mode of content delivery is the textbook. The textbook is what you should be reading. These lectures are not going to give you the full story. These lectures are merely designed to help fill in the gaps, to fill in some of the gaps. So read your textbook, take the quizzes, and make sure you do your writing assignment. Do it before the deadline. Do it before the deadline. Okay, scholars, study hard, make me proud.